Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming back from lunch to learn about the very exciting topic of fiduciary diligence, best practices, lawsuits, and lessons learned. I'm Melanie Walker from Siegel Consulting, and I'm joined by two expert panelists on this session. Marla Kreindler from the law firm Morgan Lewis, who will give a step-by-step approach to exercising fiduciary diligence, and Daniel Alexander, who is a co-founder of Retire Aware, a consulting firm singularly focused on the conflicts of interest service structures in the defined contribution market. Retire Aware has developed a methodology and rating system that helps plan sponsors assess, address, and monitor their plan participant service model for conflicts that undermine the health of the plan and plan participant retirement savings. I'm going to start with our session with a little bit of background about fiduciary best practices, beginning with where do fiduciary responsibilities for public plans come from? Well, there are many different sources, including the Contracts Clause of the United States Constitution and the exclusive benefit rules that are set forth in the Internal Revenue Code, including sections 401A and 457, as well as specific state statutes and municipal codes that provide rules on ethics and conflicts of interest which govern your plan and its fiduciaries. And all of these rules come from the common law of trusts and the court decisions that interpret those laws. When ERISA was enacted 45 years ago, it codified in federal statute important aspects of the common law of trust, and that's why public plans use ERISA rules on fiduciary duties as a best practice, even though they are not subject to its specific provisions. So, what are the duties of a fiduciary under ERISA? Well, they're mostly common sense stuff if you really think about it. First, you should act prudently when you are handling someone else's money. Second, you should select investment options that are appropriate for the purpose of saving for retirement. Third, you must act with loyalty in the interest of your participants, which means you can only use their money to pay benefits and reasonable expenses and nothing else. And of course, you must comply with plan terms and the laws that apply to your plan. One example of an ERISA rule that is a best practice for public plans is ERISA Section 408, which requires plan sponsors obtain specific disclosures from their service providers, such as a description of the services they will provide, whether those services are provided in a fiduciary capacity, and all direct and indirect compensation the provider receives. Public plans should follow the spirit of these rules, which is exercising due diligence in obtaining services from third parties in a manner that is in the best interest of the participants, even if you're not following the exact rules. Here's another example of an ERISA rule that's a best practice for public plans, and that's the participant fee disclosure regulations under ERISA 404, which require sponsors provide specific information about investments and fees under their plan. Basically, these rules require that plans must be transparent about how money can be invested under the plan and how much the plan costs to participants. So again, public plans should ensure that there's fee transparency in their communications to participants, even though the specific rules of ERISA and the format for doing that is not required. Now, I just want to touch on two important fiduciary duties under the common law of trust, and that's prudence and loyalty. First, the duty of prudence follows the prudent expert rule under ERISA, which, as we heard from Dr. Bernardsey this morning, goes something like a fiduciary must manage the plan with the skill, care, and diligence that a prudent person familiar with such matters would do under circumstances then prevailing. So exercising prudence in investment decisions requires consideration of plan investments as a whole rather than only considering each option individually. The duty of loyalty essentially requires that trustees act solely for the benefit of beneficiaries of a trust in all decisions, which means avoiding conflicts of interest. This can be difficult for trustees who must balance multiple interests when making decisions. Fortunately, good governance can mitigate conflicts of interest and the risks to the plan, such as financial, reputational, and operational risks. For example, Some common plan policies that address fiduciary duties include governance policies that should define the roles and responsibilities of all parties that run your plan, your specific investment policies, of course, as well as any ethics policies and conflicts of interest rules that apply to your plan, and procurement rules that address how you select, monitor, and compensate providers. Finally, in light of the information that was so skillfully presented by Dr. Bernarzi this morning, consider a communications policy, which may address things like your online service model, how to best utilize social media for your plan, as well as how fiduciaries and administrators talk to each other and outside parties like the public or media. And of course, you want to include cybersecurity policies and procedures. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marla, including this one.
Thank you, Melanie. So I'd like to talk to us about fiduciary diligence. How do you put all of this together? And in thinking about maybe a way to divide up our thinking about it, I thought, well, let's just think about it 1, 2, 3 in diligence. And the way that I think about it in this area is first, let's get educated. We're here at NAGDA, good start, but let's keep going. 2, importantly, consider your options. There are many different options and alternatives which we're learning about at this conference, but it's really important to think about them as a part of your fiduciary diligence process. And then 3, once you've gotten educated and know your options, apply what you know to achieve the best results for your participants. And lastly, this one comes from my mother, make no assumptions, because we know what happens when you assume. And I won't go into further detail if your mom didn't tell you that. Come ask me after. But
what happens?
Yeah, we'll tell you later. So one, get educated. From a public plan perspective, this sounds really simple, but the first thing is to really know and understand your fiduciary governance structure. And honestly, plan provisions and fiduciary governance structure really vary from one plan to the next. And so you can't make assumptions that just because someone else is up here talking about their structure that yours is the same or should be the same. You need to look at your enabling statutes for public plans. That's a statute where often the law is adopted. Some plans have separate plan and trust documents, others don't. They're just in the statutory provisions. Some plans have very specific rules and regulations, policies and procedures, authorizing resolutions, bylaws, committee charters. You can just see that it doesn't have to be complicated, but quite often there's a lot of different materials that you want to look to. And then importantly, know how and if and when you can make changes. Sometimes it's the law, so you need a change in law to change something, but often there's a lot of flexibility within that, and understanding that in the context of your plan and your structure is really the first part about getting educated. Knowing your applicable laws, again, it may be the enabling statutes Melanie mentioned. Often states have conflict of interest laws or laws that apply to public officials, and so it may not just be what's within your pension code that applies to you. Quite often it's some other rules that you want to take into account as well. And think about it, from that perspective. Could be your state constitution, the tax laws, so know your laws. And then this idea of prudence, as Melanie described it to us, think of it not as something that's going to create some difficulty for you, but more so as a way to learn. And so what the standard says is that fiduciaries are to give appropriate consideration to the specific facts and circumstances. And you saw Shlomo spelled it out a little more as well this morning too, based on the circumstances then prevailing. And so what does this mean? It's another way of saying you need to get educated, or you need to bring in someone who is educated to assist you through the process. And there's a number of ways of doing that, which could include, talking with your current providers and prospects and having them help you when there are questions. What are the solutions that they see? How can they address it? Talk to your peers. NAGDA has a great listserv that people ask questions on, but often others around you will have good solutions or ways to bring you forward. And then the other thing is always fiduciary training is a good practice, and it's something that, fiduciary training could mean training on your governance, on your plan, on really any topic. Doesn't have to be the stale presentation that you've had 3 years in a row. Feel free to mix it up, but always try to think about training when you're getting educated. Now, we've heard talk about litigation, legislative, and regulatory trends. That's always really important to focus on. I've included here some of the topics of ERISA litigation. And remember that this is NAGDA, so ERISA doesn't apply here unless we want it to apply. And so in many cases, as Melanie said, it's going to provide guidance, it's going to provide a best practice, but and sometimes the enabling statutes for some public plans actually copy ERISA. Illinois is an example where it's very similar, not identical. You want to be thoughtful, though, about what's happening in the ERISA context, and does that give me something to consider that we may want to then take into account for our plan. Sometimes the topics of ERISA litigation, some of which I've listed here, focus on revenue sharing, hidden fees, transparency. Sometimes these are good questions then to ask in this space. Other times, just because something's being litigated or driven in the ERISA litigation front doesn't mean that it's necessarily something that you'd have to do here. So think of these as topics to discuss and consider, and then how is it that you can implement a better process and procedure for your plans. We've heard from our legislative committee update yesterday that there's lots going on the regulatory front, and so we heard, I think they did a good thorough discussion of that, so I'll skip more of that, but just know that NAGDA really stays on the front of that, and Paul does a terrific job of it, and of course if you have questions, reach out to him for that. So consider your options. We're educated on our structure. Now let's continue the education and consider your options. And what do I mean by that? And I think Daniel will speak more about this in his presentation. And I've given a couple examples here, but different providers doing what you might think of as the same service or the same task will present differently just based on things that can be like the historical nature of their business or how they were set up, or maybe they did an acquisition and acquired somebody else's platform and it was set up in a certain way. And so, you might find that some providers, for example, will offer you as a group annuity contract, and others will have a mutual fund platform. Some will offer you bundled versus unbundled or open architecture programs. And these are all options and things to take into account and to really try to understand, are these options that are valuable to me and that are differentiators, and how do I want to think about that? Another example is we hear a lot of talk about participant advice and education, and there's so many different ways that you can provide good investment education to your participants. I've worked with a plan sponsor recently, and they're implementing 3 different programs, just understanding the different nature of participants and wanting to reach different groups of participants that might engage differently. And this is also an area where there's a lot of change, and so whatever program that you might have put in a couple of years ago, this could be another area of training, for example, on how have things changed, what can I learn, what's new. I think we've had sessions on RFPs, but they're always a good way to help you better understand and leverage your options. Let's see. Here we go. Couple more examples. I know I'm the lawyer on the panel, and I always think that you can use the contracts to help you create better standards and to help improve the options that are available to you. So again, as public plans, you can include something in your contract to have the provider treat you as though ERISA applies. I remember talking with a pension board, and someone said to me, "You mean we can do that?" And I said, "Absolutely, you can do that." And we did it, and she said, "Wow, that's we feel more comfortable," because in their case, their state statutes didn't have the same amount of detail or protections as ERISA, and so it was really helpful to them. And often, you'll work with someone and they'll say, "Here's our contract," and in many cases you can say, "Well, here's my contract. Let's start with mine so that I can then have uniformity of contract terms and provisions." And again, these are options that may be available to you. Another example is that often the same investment strategy will come in. I heard someone say the other day in a different wrapper. So you might get an equity strategy that you could have in a mutual fund, a collective trust, or a separately managed account. And each of these can offer different pros and cons. It's not that one is always going to be the best or one's always going to be the worst. We could sit down and go through what are the pros and cons and why are they better and what's the better fit for me. And I'm sure you could do the same, but it's just knowing these differences, knowing that even the same fund can have different share classes and what's the right share class for me. These are all good questions to be asking and to thinking about as you consider your options. Let's see. I wonder if our battery, this feels like the remote on the TV that I never know how to use, but we'll see. So far it's going okay. What can I ask? One of the questions that I like to see asked is disclosure of, the 408B2 disclosure that Melanie mentioned. This is another way of asking for disclosure of all direct and indirect compensation that my providers are receiving. Follow the money, understand what's there, and it will help you find incentives and conflicts and try to understand how is it that these compensation payments might influence then how a provider is providing service to you. Daniel, I know you're going to talk about this more, but it's look at the conflicts disclosures, review them, and remember that just because something is disclosed as a conflict doesn't mean it's bad and you have to not think about it any further or shut it down. Sometimes, it may be something that's not permitted by your laws, but often there are ways that they can be addressed or modified or revised to make it something that really works better or effectively for you. The other example that I gave, again, just showing optionality is knowing that who the person that you're working with, what role are they taking on? Are they a fiduciary to you? Like you're a fiduciary, are they the same fiduciary to you? Or are they acting as an agent? And what does it mean to be an agent for you? What kind of standards apply to them? And I put down here, something that you'll see in some contracts is they're going to provide a service to you, and then they're only responsible if they're grossly negligent. Well, who knows what gross negligence means? Anyone studied that legally? Let's just say it this way. Who likes the word gross? When you say something is gross, that's not what you want, right? Okay, and so let's just say that you could think about a different standard of care. Your standard of care is prudence and acting like a prudent expert. If the other provider's standard of care is not there, maybe that's okay, right? Because maybe what you're paying them for that service, that's an appropriate way to have the service and have the care that you want to have. Or maybe you'd think about it differently, but it's certainly something that you want to think about and have a conversation about. Let's see. Sorry again on the remote here. Now, apply what you've learned. So again, think about the RFP process as a helpful way to achieve your goals. Don't be afraid to ask questions in the RFP process. And so if there's something that's unique to you and your plan or something that's more important to you, it's okay to go to your valued consultant and say, let's ask these questions too, because this is important to us, or this is something that my board member is interested in. And I always say, ask the hard questions and negotiate the contract terms before you make your final selection. Good idea. But also think about a gap analysis. What do I mean by a gap analysis? So once you've done an RFP and people have come back and you sort of started out with your objectives on what you wanted to cover, look at it to see what's missing, what kind of service is not being provided that was really important to us, and how do we go about that? Again, look at some of your contract terms and think about them as ways to help address some of your goals and expectations. And then again, make no assumptions. Don't assume you can't make changes. People often will change their governance structure, think about it, improve it, polish it, make it better. Most legal contracts end up getting negotiated. You can do it in an appropriate way and get to good results. And then don't assume nothing changes even with your provider. So if you have a great provider that you love and you've been with them a long time, terrific, but then see what's new and what they're offering, and is there something that other clients are asking for that maybe they could help and do a better service to you. And quite often they're glad to share that with you and want you to hear about it. Think about the variations and just remember that don't assume conflicts can't be addressed. And then these last items, let's turn it over to Daniel. But if these aren't things you know about, these are good things to ask questions about and keep learning and keep on this education process.
Talk about float income. Everyone wants to know.
Later.
Okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
We could, or do you want to jump in?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Just a couple.
Yeah.
These are right up your alley. Is there any effort to have ERISA apply by statute to public plans?
The answer, I think the question was, is there an idea that ERISA would apply by statute to public plans? Unless you somehow write it into your own statute or city charter or in some way that's applicable to you, the answer to that is simply no. The ERISA excludes public plans, and I'm not aware of any efforts to change that.
And then how often should fiduciary training be provided to the governing board or committee?
Yeah, so fiduciary training, I think, is something that if you don't think about it as the sort of boring, what does it mean to be a fiduciary and what are the standards, and if you think about it as a way to get educated and to have this better sense of diligence and process, that you can almost conduct fiduciary training at every other board meeting, once a year, do something in more detail. Quite often I'll see clients that at least annually want to review the plan. They may have new trustees. They may want to make sure people understand it, understand the fees and expenses. And it's something that I think you can often bring in multiple different providers to have different viewpoints on it. So another example is if you have a target date fund, or think about what are the top 3 funds in your plan. Maybe have those providers come in and talk to you about their plan, and that's another type of, about their fund or their strategy, and that's another type of fiduciary training, if you will, that I think is important. Is that it? Yeah.
More for Daniel.
Yeah, Daniel.
Great. Thank you. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. First, I want to acknowledge all of you in the room and for your endurance. I'm sure these aren't the easiest sessions to always go through. It seems like when you come to these big conferences, it's eat, it's drink, it's sleep, it's go to class, and rinse, repeat, and continue to do it. So just want to acknowledge your endurance in going through this, and also acknowledge the importance of the roles that you play as plan sponsors that oversee retirement plans in the public sector. As pointed out earlier, the Department of Labor and other regulatory agencies may have jurisdiction over the private markets. There's no such jurisdiction, such as ERISA, that really has its stamp on public sector retirement. It's really up to you in the room to be responsible for not only protecting your plans, but protecting your employees. The area of plan governance that I focus in on, and my firm RetireAware, along with our Chief Legal Officer, Alan Steinberg, focus in on, are conflict of interest service structures that serve not only to undermine the health of your retirement plan, but can impact participant savings. And so I want to go through some real-life examples of what this looks like when it exists inside of your plan, and what are some of the questions that you can ask not only yourself, but you can be asking record keepers that you work with. Okay? So I'm going to start off with exactly what does conflict look like inside of a plan? So here's a great slide for you to kind of dive into. So before you do that, I'm going to walk through what some of these names are, what some of these references are, what some of these numbers are. But I'd like you to think back to the last time each of you in this room went through the RFP process. And you had to compare one record keeper to another record keeper. And as Marla pointed out earlier, some of these record keepers have very similar services that they engage in. Some of them, if you go in an unbundled structure, might have the same investment offerings. You know, you can select the investment offerings and they can support that. But what is different about them that should be carefully evaluated before selecting a record keeper? And so the example that I have up on your screen today will show what two record keepers look like that offer record-keeping services to your plan. The example here is a $100 million plan. I know some of you in the room have plans that are significantly larger than that. Some may have plans that are smaller than that. But the reality is, a $100 million plan is a substantial plan, and the pricing that goes into record-keeping services for these plans, the direct pricing, is what is represented in the gray portion of this chart. If you look on the left side of the chart, it's the explicit cost. It's 3 basis points for the opaque provider that will generate a roughly $30,000 in direct fees to the plan in a given year. If you look on the right side of your chart, you'll see the transparent provider, where it says 10 basis points or $100,000 in direct fees to the plan in a given year. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Why is the opaque provider or the less transparent provider lower cost? Why is a transparent provider higher cost? Some of the elements that you really want to take a look at is what is the service model implemented by a record keeper that can generate fees that are, 1, undisclosed to you as the record keeper, and 3, cause a significant increase in the amount of revenue generated from not only access to the data of your retirement plan that you oversee, but access to employees on a regular basis. And that access can be in several different mediums. It can be phone-based when your participants call into a 1-800 number and speak to someone on the other end of the line. For those of you that have on-site service advisors, on-site service representatives, the names can vary from record keeper to record keeper, but for on-site representation, are these individuals incented to sell different products, to sell different services? Okay? And that's what we have represented in the black box that you'll see, which is the next box up, is what's called capture rate assets. In the world of record keeping, this may be referred from record keeper to record keeper slightly differently, but what you must always consider is your asset of your plan is a highly valuable component to your plan, if not the most valuable component to your plan. And possibly equally as important is the data that supports that plan. What I want you to think about is capture rate. Capture rate is essentially the amount of assets in your plan that get distributed every year on a non-taxable basis. What does that mean? Rollouts. How many of your participants meet some form of distributable event in your plan, whether it's age or separation from service, and make the election to roll their money out to another IRA or to another provider of another 457 plan or another 403B plan? How often does that money leave? Capture rate for that record keeper, the incumbent record keeper to your plan, is what % of those distributions from that plan am I able to capture that are being distributed from the plan? It is not without, it is certainly a possibility, and it's actually in many cases a reality with plans that we deal with, where this is part of the pricing mechanism inside of a record keeper, within a record keeper pricing model, is consideration to how much of those distributed assets will I capture and be part of my capture rate. 23%, 30%, we've seen plans up to 40% of assets distributed from the plan being kept by the record keeper, and I'll talk a little bit in the next couple slides as to why that's so important. The next slide you'll see on top of that is retail sales. While capture rate, there's only a certain amount of assets that leave a plan in a given year, which is capture rate, only a certain percent. It's a finite number. So it's a finite number of assets that can be captured. It's a finite amount of revenue that can be generated. What you should also consider is, are there incentives to sell general retail products? Do you need life insurance? Do you need long-term care? Do you need a 529 plan? Do you need annuities? Do you need index annuities? These are retail sales that really have no cap on them, and depending on the compensation structure and the incentive structure of the individuals who interact with your participants, these numbers can be pretty strong. And so what you'll see here is why a transparent provider will charge you directly for the services outlined in your record-keeping agreement, and those fees will be specific to the job that they're being hired to do. What you'll find with an opaque provider or less transparent provider is a really low price plan. It could be either lower price than the transparent provider or just on par. But the amount of revenue generated for the services that they're engaging in is far higher, okay? So I'm gonna walk you through why this is important, things that you can do to help protect your plan participants and create an environment that doesn't have this kind of conflict present, and what you can do if you find some of these issues in order to remedy them, okay? So in the next slide, one of the very first questions that I think can be asked of a record keeper before you go through the process of understanding what their investments are, what their fee structure is, what the administrative capabilities are, is really making sure that you have a foundation to ensure that conflict doesn't exist within your plan. And one of the primary ways of doing that is understand incentive. How are plan representatives compensated? And then once you ask once, ask again. Because a typical answer, if you've asked this before in an RFP process, a typical answer you might receive is, they receive a salary. Or they receive compensation that's in line with the best interests of your plan. I would dig a little bit further. There's a number of public resources that are available to you to truly understand how individuals for a specific firm are compensated. There's a form, and I'll mention the name, but I don't encourage you to rush out and go read it, because you probably have far more important things to do. But if you decide to do that today, it's called Form ADV Part 2A. It's a form that all firms that are registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission must file outlining their compensation structure as it relates to advisory products that they have, and it must identify conflicts of interest that they have as well. Taking the time to ask pressing questions as to how the representatives are paid that service your plan is mission critical. Additionally, if you ask once, I would also ask additional follow-up questions such as, well, what is the percent of a salary, if you say they pay salary, that they receive relative to variable compensation? If they receive variable compensation, is it variable compensation for services that they provide to the plan participant, or are they for services that they're providing outside the scope of services that have been promised to the plan? Next, let's take a look at data. Data is another question you'd want to ask. Going on with some of these lawsuits that was mentioned earlier, there's a number of them out there, and one of the topics of concern is, well, who owns the data, right? As I see it, there's probably three individuals or three groups or entities that can own the data. One, does the record keeper own your data? Do you own your data? Or does the plan participant, your employees, do they own their own data? Because I'll tell you, one of those is the wrong answer. And it's not up to a regulatory authority or somebody else to tell you who owns that data. It's up to you in the room that manage these plans to determine who owns that data. Secondly, the data that you have in your plan, when you hire a record keeper to provide record-keeping services that are that are detailed, the scope of services that they're responsible for engaging in with you and your employees are detailed. How is that data they're able to access? Participant social security numbers, age, account balances, contribution rates. How are all of these data points utilized? Are they shared with affiliates? Are they shared with outside firms? There's a number of record keepers, if you simply go through their privacy policy, they'll explicitly share with you that they share these with credit rating agencies and different data aggregation organizations for the sole purpose of learning more about your participants in order to market and sell non-plan related products. Next, who's talking to your people? There was a firm that there was a university that we were supporting. It was about a little bit after we formed the organization. This is probably late 2017. And they were concerned about having individuals support their plan participants because they were really spread out in terms of their campuses. And the concern was, well, how can we get people out there to support our plan participants? How can we pay them? And how will we know that the services that they're rendering are in line with the scope of the plan? And so they've asked us to come in and kind of take a look at what they've been doing for the past couple of years. And the first thing that we did was took a look at who each of these individuals are. There were 8 individuals. 4 of these individuals that were hired to engage with these plan participants had disclosures, which if you go to FINRA Broker Check, if you have individuals that are servicing your plan, it's an easy public resource for you to use, finrabrokercheck.com. And in looking at these individuals that are servicing this plan and helping these participants, 4 of them had disclosures. All 4 disclosures had to do with forgery. So think about this. You talk about fiduciary risk and fiduciary concern. Folks, I don't care if you're ERISA or if you're non-ERISA. If you're concerned about the threat of litigation, putting a group of people in front of your plan participants, in front of your own employees, the people that come to work for you each day, and 4 of those individuals have disclosures because they're engaged in activities that are fraudulent, that is problematic. So there's a lot of steps that you can take in terms of background checks around the individuals. If you haven't done it already, I would encourage you to do so. 2 first steps you can take are public resources, investor.gov or FINRA Broker Check, okay? And next, what are they selling? You each understand the products that are outlined in the record-keeping agreement, what you've agreed to. You understand the fee structure of these products, the investments inside the products. Outside of these products, what else is being presented to your participants? Are you aware of what the products are? Do you endorse these products that are non-plan related? If the record keeper you choose to do business with also has a product manufacturing division that produces retail products and they sell life insurance, annuities, mutual funds, are you also endorsing these products? Do your participants fully understand the differentiation between the group product that they're in and the retail products that they may be solicited? The last, Marla brought up indirect compensation and direct compensation. These are really these are ERISA, ERISA and fiduciary language. What you should consider is that direct compensation or explicit fees, direct fees that are paid by you, by the plan. Indirect fees are paid from some source other than the plan. But what's important is when assessing the total amount of compensation that's paid by the plan, it's important for a fiduciary in the case of ERISA or for yourselves in engaging in best practice to understand the reasonableness of the compensation. Is the total amount of compensation paying fair relative to the services that are being rendered to us? And there's really two sides to that coin. If you think back to the initial slide, there were 2 amounts. There's 3 basis points and 10 basis points. Not knowing any differentiation between the 2 vendors, if they were both providing the same service, I think it's very fair, it's very reasonable that you would go with the lower cost provider. Knowing what you may know now and understanding different revenue strategies that can be deployed, I think it's fair to say that the lower cost was unreasonable. Why should I subject my employees to solicitations from third parties to engage in products that are 10 times, 20 times the fee that my participant will pay in a given year? It's a healthy question to consider for you and your board. Next, I want to take you, now that you have some idea regarding compensation and things that you should look at, if you had to paint the perfect picture of who you want engaging with your participants, what would that picture look like? So here's a graph for you to weigh in on. Right in the middle of that graph, I know it might be a bit hard to see in the back, but there's a line that runs right in the middle of it. And what that says is it says threshold, and then above it, it says out. Below it, it says in. The black portion of this graph is fixed salary and a true salary, a livable wage salary. The blue portion of this graph is variable compensation. Variable compensation is not altogether bad. In many ways, it can be very helpful for your plan. Various kinds of bonus structures and incentives that support the growth and the health of your retirement plan. Once that variable compensation goes outside of the scope of your plan, and then once it turns into that last gray slide, which are commissions, you're now engaging in incentive structures that are outside the scope of services that you've hired a record keeper to engage in, and it subjects your employees to solicitations that are undisclosed and outside of what they expect is their retirement plan provider. So here's some questions that you can ask, not only yourself, but plan advisors that you may work with. For those of you working with consultants, this is a really good opportunity for a healthy discussion of next steps that you can take in identifying conflict within your plan. First is what are my employees paying in record-keeping fees? What price are they truly paying? If my record-keeping fee is so low that the record keeper who is engaging in these transactions can't make any money off the record-keeping fee, or at least make money where this is a relationship to which they want to continue to engage in, what other price are they paying? Are they having to buy proprietary life insurance from that same record keeper? Are they having to buy an index annuity from an affiliate of the record keeper? What is the cost that's being added to what they're currently paying? Next is what's the data worth? We all know, you can ask any economist, the value in a plan. Think of the value if there was a traditional broker that, on the side of the street that wasn't part of your retirement plan, but he had access to every single individual's Social Security number, their account balance, their contribution rates, their beneficiary name, the beneficiary's birthday, how often they switch investments, how are they invested. Every time does the market go crazy, do they jump into the fixed account? Well, maybe that's someone that needs a more conservative investment. This is highly valuable information. And what I'm not saying here in this second question is don't start selling your employees' data to brokers on the side of the street. That's not the guidance here, but certainly the guidance is consider you have a very valuable asset as part of your plan that should be protected as a very important asset to the plan. Next is indirect revenue being generated. So I explained earlier the direct and the indirect forms of compensation. This indirect revenue relates strictly to all of these undisclosed products and services that are sold. And by the way, when I say undisclosed explicitly to you, meaning you have an RFP or you ask a question, quite often if you dig close enough, and we've had this be the case a number of times, inside of privacy statements, the record keepers actually do tell you, we are going to market to your people, we are going to use your data, and we're going to do this. But it often goes unrecognized. But when you dig a little bit further and you want to recognize what is that indirect revenue, if you have a plan and your expectation is to be paying that record keeper $15,000, $20,000, $100,000 a year in fees, if you found out that you were paying $500,000 in fees, would that make you upset? We have plans where we've worked with where the indirect revenue being generated was not only multiples, it was into the tens of millions of dollars in indirect compensation that was being generated. Worth considering, especially for the large state plans out there. And lastly, think of your participant education programs. For a number of you that run state plans that have a side-by-side defined contribution plan with a side-by-side defined benefit plan, there should be some concern over the portability of one moving into the other, particularly when there's a financial incentive for not only outside brokers outside the scope of your plan, but approved plan providers either in a state deferred compensation plan or other smaller plans that employees of that plan are able to participate in your state plan, have plan providers that have an incentive to transfer employees' defined benefit assets into an investment plan or into a portable defined contribution plan for the sole purpose of rolling that money out. The dangers that are there are quite incredible, considering the fact that not only do people have a difficult time in managing the risk of spending down that money, there's a risk of losing health subsidies and other features that are present inside the state retirement plan. Okay, here's three last factors before we're going into some Q&A that I'll leave you with. Three things to be mindful of. And by the way, as Marla said earlier, conflict within a plan is not altogether bad until the point that it is. There's certain areas of conflict where they're mitigated, can be supportive of a plan. But there's certain areas of conflict that need to be excised from the plan. So the first is, be wary of the activities and communications that imply some kind of endorsement of the record keeper that you've hired. Endorse the services that they're doing as the record keeper as outlined in your record keeping agreement, and be mindful of doing things side by side with a record keeper that imply that yes, all their other services are wonderful and you should really engage in these other services with this record keeper. 2, serving on a retirement record keeper's committee or some other arrangement that they may have or a council can be perceived as being a conflict, particularly when it comes time to you having an RFP and having to make the difficult decision of saying this longtime record keeper might need to go and we're bringing in somebody else. And lastly, I could steal Marla's name, Marla's mom's comment in making no assumptions. Don't take verbal commitments, don't take verbal agreements to doing certain things as being law for your plan. Make sure everything is documented. If you ask a representative of your retirement plan and you pull them aside after this and you say, hey, let me ask you something. How are you compensating your people? And if they say this is how we're doing it, ask for that in writing and ask for it to be specific in writing. If you ask them, how is my data being used? Get a specific answer as to how your data is being used and make sure these items are documented. All right, turn it back over to you, Melanie.
Thank you. We have a lot of great questions. We'll get to as many as we can. And I'm going to start with a couple that dovetail very nicely into what Daniel was talking about. With the rise in demand from participants for managed accounts, how do plan sponsors navigate the conflicts of interest associated with record keepers offering their own managed account solutions? And then kind of a second part of that is, would you consider a record keeper whose account reps are incentivized for enrolling members in managed accounts a conflict of interest?
Yeah, so this is a really good question. I also want to just clarify for all of you, and you can probably tell from the fact that some of the things I was saying. One, I'm not a lawyer. And two, our firm is a consulting firm that's strictly on conflicts of interest. We don't deal with investments. But structurally, what this question is really good at is getting at is the conflicts existing inside of a managed account program. There's a number of managed account scenarios, we can say, where there's a managed account that has, it's almost like we'll do it for you. It's automated, right? And it comes at a certain price, and that price can be 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 basis points on plan assets. We've seen it even go up to a full %. And then there's a free option, right? And the free option essentially says, here's the advice, implement it yourself, and it's free, or it's some real marginal number. And in plans that we've worked with where you have advisors, representatives that are on the ground, you will find almost every single individual is in the higher cost plan, and there's nobody at all in the lower cost plan. So to the extent that it's an issue, this is something that you would want to document through participant communication to your employees. Make sure that they understand, one, the incentive structure behind getting inside of a managed account, one, and the differences between the two, the compensation paid for the involvement or participation in one managed account versus no compensation for the other managed account. Really be sure that you explain the differences in fees between the two. And before even getting to that point, we're evaluating a record keeper to determine whether or not to offer managed accounts. You're in a position to negotiate this. Consider your role within a plan. Look, there's a lot of record keepers that want your business. Make them earn your business. If that means having a greatly reduced managed account that's 20 basis points, 15 basis points, that's not reliant on specific proprietary investments in the plan, I would encourage you to do so. But first and foremost, make sure you outline the differences between the higher cost plan and the lower cost plan.
Can I add?
Please, absolutely.
Yeah, I would just say that this is something that we've thought about recently, and it's a great question, because if you think about managed accounts, that's something that's within your plan. And so I've worked with some clients where they say, we want to promote managed accounts, and so the fact that there may be variable compensation to promote that is useful. Now, you may want to have the ability to listen in on the calls and understand how that's being promoted, but then maybe, I've worked with other clients that say, wait a minute, we have managed accounts, we have target date funds, and we think they're both important, and so we don't want somebody who is going to promote one where they have a fee and not the other one where their fee is different. And so that's exactly, I think, the type of consideration that you want to think about, and then make sure that this type of behavior is something that you understand and that it's addressed in either your contracts or policies, and something that you're aware of, because it may or may not be a good answer for your plan.
Thank you. We'll go back to basics a little bit here. There's several questions in this area. Is fiduciary insurance a good idea, and if so, under what circumstances? And I'll let
Fiduciary what?
fiduciary insurance.
Oh, yeah, so fiduciary insurance can come up in a variety of contexts, and so you can think about it from your own perspective, but then you can also think about fiduciary insurance in the context of any providers that you hire. And that's typically, if we start with the latter one, that's typically something that we think of as part of diligence, as is making sure that there's minimum levels of insurance that's maintained. And increasingly, we're also seeing questions about cyber insurance and policies, and how is that addressed? So I think the question was, what about me? Do I need it? But I just thought I'd start with saying, often you want to think about it in terms of your providers and have them provide you copies of certificates, and again, have that be in the contracts. In terms of, from your perspective, I think part of that question is, in what ways are you subject to legal action, and then how would that be paid, and would insurance help address that in any way? And I see different views on this among public plans. Often there just isn't the same need as you might see in the ERISA area, but I think it is something worthwhile in considering and understanding. Yeah.
What she said.
Good. Another question, there's several of these that are similar. Are there any current cases against litigation against governmental 403B plans for breach of fiduciary duty?
Yeah, so I think the question was, are there current cases of governmental 403B plans for breach of fiduciary duty? We're seeing, you're hearing in the press that there's a number of 403B cases out there, and largely those cases relate to questions having to do with ERISA and the application of ERISA and fees and expenses. And also just, I think, addressing what we've seen as the evolution of 403B plans as we've seen the regulatory climate. And so for the most part, that's where we've seen the attention of litigation over the past few years, is on the ERISA side of it, not on the governmental side.
Yeah, I would also weigh in and say, while you haven't had, in the public sphere, the same kind of ERISA responsibilities or fiduciary responsibilities, there is definitely a trend that is moving towards acknowledgement of the sale of products and services that are outside the scope of what's traditionally allowed for. The use of data is becoming a big one, and who owns data. That will only trickle down to the public sector retirement space. As well as fees and different kinds of conflicts that exist. So while it may start at ERISA, it can always make its way down to the public sector.
I'm going to piggyback on it because there's a question about, it says, I believe most record keepers take the position that they own our data. How would you write a provision to make sure that we, the plan, own our own data?
Can you repeat that, please?
It's a question about how does a plan sponsor make
Sure.
sure their contract says they own their own data and not the record keeper?
Yeah, so I think there's a very short answer to this, is whoever asked that question, ask yourself this. Do you think you own the data? If the answer to that is yes, make sure that's in your record keeping agreement. We own the data. Look, there's a number of record keepers that you can work with, and if that record keeper says we're not doing business with you because we own that data and we do what we want with it, we could say, fine, I'll go find a new record keeper. I think what is fair to say is record keepers should be able to have access to the data and use that data for the purposes of carrying out services relative to the record keeping agreement, right? They have to be able to administer the plan, and they have that leverage to use that data for those purposes. Anything outside of that, they have no leverage to say we own that data and we can use it what we want to use it for. You know what's interesting, inside the retirement space, everyone familiar with HIPAA? I know this isn't a healthcare conference, but we're familiar with HIPAA. There's all these protections, right? When you go to the doctor can't turn around and say, you won't believe what was on Sally's back. Like it's the most disgusting. You can't say that. When it comes to your retirement savings, there is nothing protecting personal retirement savings. Even you, despite the fact that you're the plan sponsor, your own personal data that's inside of your retirement plan, there is nothing protecting that data. You had a meeting yesterday on cybersecurity. A registered representative or a broker that makes commissions off moving money from your retirement plan to an outside product that you've hired to put in front of your employees decides to jump ship and go work for another broker, what do you think they take with them? You only have to Google, broker data theft, and you'll come up with so many different examples of people taking information because they own it, not you own it. So I think you can write that into your record-keeping agreement. I don't know if Marla has. Marla does a lot of contract work. Maybe you want to opine there?
Yeah, I would say that what we're seeing in agreements on data and data security and ownership has really just changed over the past few years. And so, for sure, if it's something where you're in the process of an RFP now, definitely consider it. If your contract hasn't been around for a while, maybe something worthwhile to refresh. And you probably have expertise, or you may have expertise internally. So if you think of anyone in your organization who is already negotiating technology agreements or data agreements, that you probably have some really good, in your risk department, really good internal expertise and knowledge of contracts that could help you with this, and that if not, there's any, your outside counsel or others can help with it, but you probably have the resources, and it is something that you want to look at, and that typically we spend a fair amount of time thinking about in contracts today.
Great. This could be both of you. Is there an implicit endorsement of a record keeper's other services when the plan sponsor doesn't have a disclaimer to the opposite? And how can a plan sponsor provide clarity to participants about this?
I'll go ahead and start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so think of the implicit endorsement. It could almost be argued that there's implicit endorsement as a result of omission. So you go through this RFP process, you go through this selection process, and you evaluate all these factors that a record keeper is able to do inside the plan, but you fail to address all the stuff on the periphery. What are your conflicts of interest? Do you offer services outside the scope of the record-keeping agreement? How are your individuals paid? What other kind of stuff do you sell? If you omit saying it, and then you put these individuals in front of your plan participants for the purpose of having them enroll in the retirement plan, and then you say there's a communication education program where they provide education seminars, or you encourage them to do a quote-unquote free financial plan, or you encourage them to go to a seminar on income, or go to a seminar on retirement, or in this case of public sector, go learn more about your state-defined benefit plan and what your options are there with DROP or something else. That would, and your employee says, okay, I'll go ahead and go to these employment seminars, and then when they're pitched a product to help support them through retirement, it is very reasonable for your employee to say, you know what, my employer hired this record keeper that put this person in place. My employer must trust these individuals. That's why they're speaking to me. That's why they're telling me to go to these seminars. I choose to do business with them. So I think it's very fair that by omission, we often engage in implicit endorsement. And that's why it's so mission critical to, one, not only understand what the record keepers do, but to disclose to your employees through communications what the role of the record keeper is and what the role of the record keeper is not.
Yeah, I often think of omission too as another way that I was framing the gap analysis is to think about what's in your contract, what's not in your contract. Something else is, are they asking you to approve something, or are you really expecting them to take responsibility for that? So all these words can have meaning and importance, and are things to really work your way through and just make sure you're comfortable with it. In some cases, you want to outsource the service. In other cases, no. You want to have a closer control on it and be that approving party. But it's just making sure that what the services is being provided is really what you want for your plan and have thought about and is decided is best for your plan.
I'm going to ask this question because I've been hearing it all morning, so I'm going to turn it to the panel. From this morning's keynote presentation, do you think a plan's governing body has a fiduciary duty to oversee and provide due diligence to the plan's digital platforms, similar to its duty to focus on investment selection and monitoring?
Yeah, so so let's just say that was a really interesting and educational presentation, and I'm thinking about it. I love the thought leadership that NAGDCA brings to us. But the way that I would typically think about some of the topics that were discussed, which I think are excellent things to think about, is that I think about that as what we think of as a settlor role, which doesn't necessarily imply fiduciary. So if you think about it, when you're encouraging participants to participate in the plan to create a better outcome and to create higher retirement income for them, that you think about that as something that's the right thing to do and that you want to get behind. But then if you put, like, for example, the lens of ERISA on that, is you wouldn't necessarily think of that as a fiduciary duty or something that's subject to the same type of fiduciary duties. This is a little technical, but I might phrase it differently is what I'm trying to say, that it sounds like a good idea to be really thoughtful about it, but I don't know that I would say that then becomes a fiduciary duty in the same way as investment policies.
Yeah, I would say outside the scope of being a fiduciary act that you want to engage in, keep in mind what we talked about earlier when it comes to data protection. When you engage in some kind of digital platform or some kind of online tool that participants can use for education. You want to be mindful of a record keeper's willingness to aggregate personal data that's outside the scope of the plan, personal email addresses, other forms of contact. Essentially, what often happens if a record keeper becomes deselected, while they may take a snapshot of all the information you have and store that data for the purpose of soliciting people once the money might be mapped to that new vendor to bring the money back, there's also ways to aggregate data. Someone mentioned managed accounts as well earlier. You can aggregate a lot of data by getting people to participate in different kinds of services, especially online or digital services, than they would traditionally participate in.
I think we are out of time with that, but we'll stay up here for a few minutes if people want to answer some of their questions that they had directed at you guys.
Sure.